Hi friends, it's your girl Harpo. Welcome to this episode of Brown Girl Guilt titled Releasing Sexual Shame. Now, before we jump into this episode, I really want to preface it by saying that I'm going to provide a content warning. This episode is going to be heavy. It's going to talk about a lot, and it might bring up some emotions, feelings, memories for you that might not necessarily be pleasant, and you might not necessarily be ready to deal with them in this moment. If that's the case, pause the episode, go take care of yourself. And if you feel like you can come back to it, definitely come back to it. But if you can't come back to it, that's okay. I'm not going to get upset. In this episode, we're going to talk about sexual shame. We're going to talk about guilt attached to sex and sexuality. And we're also going to touch on sexual violence. And again, if all of those things are going to make you feel worse by the end of this episode than better, then I would suggest that you turn this episode off. This episode is titled Releasing Sexual Shame because for most of last year, which would be 2020, I worked on releasing the shame that I had attached to my sexuality. And it's been a very, very liberating experience. And if this entire season at Brown Girl Guild is about us exploring what it means to truly love ourselves, what it's meant to truly love myself is to release all the emotions that have held me back, including shame, including guilt, including anger, and including the idea that my body is not my own and that pleasure is not my own, and that I'm not deserving of pleasure. I'm not deserving of respect when it comes to my body. Last year, I had many moments where I got to release the shame that I have attached to sex and sexuality. When I was younger, when I was a teenager, I had my experience with sexual violence where my body was compromised and my power was taken away from me. And at the time, because I was so young, I was like 14 or 15, I completely shut it down. I buried it very, very deep inside of me because thinking about it and reliving it and feeling the emotions was too painful and too confusing, also, because at that time I had had absolutely no sort of experience that was sexual or intimate in nature. And for me, that was actually my first experience with anything related to sexuality. And at the time, it wasn't consensual. It wasn't anything that, I wanted to take part in. And so when it happened, I buried it very, very, very deep inside of me. It wasn't until I would say 4 or 5 years later that when I became, a woman in her 20s, that I remembered that that had happened to me. My body had done such a good job at forgetting it that I completely forgot it happened until I was in a therapy session and I was trying to figure out the roots of where all of this shame, guilt, and anguish was coming from. And so when I said it out loud for the first time, it became easier and easier to work with. And it wasn't until I think the at least close to the 10th time that I talked about it out loud that it became easier to trace the roots of where the shame was coming from. And so last fall, I finally mustered up the courage to talk to my dad. And I told my dad what had happened to me 10 years ago up until that point. It'd been 10 years since I experienced that. I experienced it when I was 14 or 15, and now I was 24, 25. And I remember sitting down with my dad and telling him, Dad, there's this really big secret that I feel like I have to tell you. And we're going to get into why I felt like my dad was the one that had to know for me to feel fully liberated and free of the guilt and the shame a little bit later on in this episode with today's guest. But it was in telling my dad that I was able to fully release the shame that was attached to my sexuality. And then again, when I was able to sit down with the person that I actually experienced the sexual violence with, was another time that I was able to really release the sexual shame that I was carrying. I did that. I got to sit down with a person that had subjected me to the violence all those years ago and actually say to them that this is what you did. And you might not remember, and you might not even have been impacted by it, but the entire course of my life and the way that I have approached intimacy, pleasure, sexuality, my body has all been governed by that one time that you tried to take advantage of me. And I will say, in all honesty, that when I sat across from this person, I was fully ready. I might not have been ready 6 months ago, or perhaps before the conversation that I had with my dad, or maybe even 5 years before that, or, maybe even a few months after the original incident happened. But when I sat there in that moment, that version of Harpo was fully ready. That version of Harpo was able to say it to their face without it being needed to be confirmed or validated. In this episode, we're going to talk a lot about sexual shame, and the guest of this podcast episode is someone that I've wanted to have this conversation with for an incredibly long time. Abneet Sandhar is the guest of this episode, and she is a trained classical Indian yoga guide, a feminine embodiment coach, and a certified holistic nutritionist and chef. Now, she is obsessed with guiding women back to their inner healing capability and reclaiming inner power. She encourages women in her practice to enter their bodies more fully in order to show up more deeply in every aspect of their lives, whether it be in intimate relating, communication, money, and sex. After years of studying spiritual self healing techniques, meditation, classical tantric yoga, and dance, she brings to all of us the nourished woman, a safe space for women of all walks of life to come together in community to celebrate and express their most honest, raw selves. My journey through releasing sexual shame did not happen with Abneet, and God, do I wish it did. And so, this episode is for all of you to get acquainted with Abneet, because if there is in any way that she can help you reclaim your power, well, I would love to help facilitate it. Hello, Abneet. Welcome to the Brown Girl Guilt podcast.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here.
I'm so excited to finally sit down with you in this capacity. I've been following you on Instagram for so long. And, I think I was like enamored by what you were doing before I even understood what you were doing. And I'm just so glad that I get to have this conversation with you and that the Brown Girl Guild community gets to become acquainted with you.
Beautiful. I'm super, super excited to dive in.
So before we dive into talking about, sexual shame and the roots of it and how to navigate it, you're a feminine embodiment coach, and I want to know what that means. What is a feminine embodiment coach? How does one become one, and why does one become one?
Basically, Harpo, what I'm doing and why I became interested in this work is myself, like many others in this current society, um, we're kind of living in a toxic masculine paradigm,
Hmm.
right? And so we're hyper producing, we're go go go. It's really dominating in that field, and so it's very disconnected when we're always in that mode from our like divine, tender, soft, but still super powerful feminine energy. So I kind of fell into this work a few years ago when I had my own awakening in my body, and I realized that this is the medicine needed not just for people who are in women's bodies, but for as a mass consciousness. We
Hmm.
need to re-enter our bodies, understanding our emotions, feeling safe to express our emotions, and actually living inside of our bodies. Because again, I use this term, um, you know, it's like a disassociation. We're living in a way where we're kind of just a little bit outside of our bodies, um, the disassociation disease, like we're not, or the disembodiment disease, I like to say actually. It's like we're not really in our bodies. We're kind of neck up, right? We're always in our heads. And um, it's so important now more than ever that we have embodied leaders,
Hmm.
right? We have people actually living inside of their bodies who understand where power lives in their bodies, so that we're holistic and we're plugged in and tuned in to the entire um, world, like in terms of the sentient world, all the creatures in the world, and the whole like Earth, that we're actually plugged in as supernatural beings.
Hmm. Yeah, it's interesting that you're saying, living in our bodies. I remember when I was, before I understood, before I had my awakening in my consciousness, I used to always write in my journal as an affirmation that I want to start living in my body more because I live in my
Mm.
head a lot and I overthink a lot. But I never really understood like what that means and what that entails to really live in your body. And it wasn't until I started to live in my body that I really started to remember things that had happened to my body. Like my mind might have forgotten things that had happened to my body where my body felt compromised or unsafe. But it wasn't until I stepped out of that, like the mind, and stepped into my body that I was able to realize my body is carrying so much that it wants me to address and work on and
Mhm.
release. And there's this book that I haven't had a chance to read, but it says the body keeps count or the body keeps score.
Mhm.
And that is so true. I always think to myself, I know you're a nutritionist and you're a certified chef. Like my awakening came through my body because I changed my nutrition. I
Mhm.
got rid of all the foods that weren't working for my body, and my spiritual awakening happened through my body. So I love that you say like living in your body, because so many
Yeah.
people, we walk around thinking that we're all just like one big blob, but there's so many
Yeah.
different elements and fragments to us.
Absolutely. Our bodies tell stories that no book could tell. We
Mhm.
are living histories of our ancestors. And I think that's also why it's scary as a mass consciousness. Our society caters to people being disembodied, right? It
Mhm.
caters to it because we don't want to face collective trauma. We don't
Yeah.
because this is a thing. It's a beautiful awakening journey to go on this type of soul work, but it's also painful as fuck.
Mhm.
It's shadow work involved. So you're going to have to feel all those old memories of, like you said, not feeling safe in the body. You might even feel some stuff from your ancestors coming through. And so we don't want to deal with feeling discomfort in the body. So we have pharmaceuticals. So we have chemicals in our foods. We have pornography. We have, name your addiction, society will give it to you.
Right.
Right. And so a part of this awakening process is to start to see, like, oh my god, like, look around, like, what have I been doing, right? Like, this is not actually helping me be in my body. This is actually helping me disassociate.
Mhm. And I think like sometimes I think like what a sad thing to not want to live in your body. I mean, sometimes it can be incredibly difficult and hurtful for people, but what an incredibly sad thing for us as a society, in people in masses, to not want to live in our bodies. And I think it wasn't until I understood my body as like a vessel through which I get to experience this human experience, and that might go over the heads of a lot of people listening, but we do know that we do die one day, and our bodies
Mhm.
get left here, and then there's this common understanding across many beliefs that our souls go somewhere else.
Mhm.
And so if this is the body and this is the vessel that we've been granted to move through this entire experience in this version of whatever, then it's extremely sad that we don't want to spend enough time in that vessel, and we don't want to
Mhm.
cherish and value that vessel.
Mhm. I have a deep hope that we are in the middle of a global awakening,
Hmm.
and I feel it. And I also have there's a term I use in my private coaching called compassionate curiosity. And it's like we have to have compassion and curiosity for ourselves, because a lot of these things of that we spoke about disassociation, is they're simply coping mechanisms, right?
Hmm.
Like, we just are trying to survive. So it's better to just, pop that pill or just watch Netflix till you die, right? It's like, I'd just rather do that than have to deal with this discomfort of being in a body. So, I mean, I think it's two part. It's coping mechanism that we just naturally start to do, and then it's also society feeding into it as well. And then keep in mind as well, like, a lot of the trauma that we face here on earth happens to many of us when we're in childhood. And so in a way, it's really smart what our bodies do and what our consciousness does. It does create these coping mechanisms, but it does those work for a certain amount of time, right? Like,
Mhm.
they help keep us alive and keep us be able to put one foot in front of the other.
Yeah, I remember sitting down once during a meditation and just bawling my eyes out because I was saying to my body, thank you so much for just holding so much and holding me through all of it because I have been very mean to you. I've been very, very
Mm.
hurtful to you. But all you've ever done is protect me and make sure that, I still get through whatever it is that I'm getting through. And it was on the other side of like, I stopped disassociating. And I mentioned this in the intro as well that when I've had my first ever experience with sexual violence, I think I was like 14 or 15 at the time. And I just buried it so deep in my body that my mind actually forgot about it. And it wasn't
Mhm.
until I sat in a therapy session that, the therapist asked me if I had ever experienced something like that. And my mind initially was like, very quick to say no, but then my body was like, no, 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 we've been through this. Like, I know I've been carrying it and I've been hiding it for all this time. We've definitely been through it. And it wasn't until then that I was like, oh my goodness, my poor body has been storing this secret for
Oh,
so
yeah.
long that my
Yeah.
mind just did not want to open up with. And I coped with it by drinking a lot of alcohol. And it
Mhm.
wasn't like it was normal because it's like, oh, it's just a 19-year-old who just got, who just turned legal drinking age. And that's why she's acting this way. But my body always knew, and my body was still taking care of me because it was like, we know she's going through something.
Absolutely. Isn't it amazing, right? How we just can find ways to help ourselves, but until it's not helping, right? And that's the
Hmm.
thing. That's how the body speaks. The body does speak, and it breaks down, and maybe you'll start to develop a rash, or you always have stomach issues. Like, it's all related to how um, trauma is stored in the body.
Hmm.
Yeah.
So, I want to talk about that trauma a little bit. I want to
Mm.
talk about sexual shame. This episode is titled Releasing Sexual Shame.
Yeah.
And I want to really go to the roots of sexual shame. You and I talked about that too in our initial conversation of like, how can we go to the roots of this and then work our way up?
Yeah.
So, for you, where do you think that sexual shame is coming from and where is it coming from? And I know that you said something about, we're in a culture of like mass toxic masculinity, and when I think about those words, the other word that automatically flashes in my head is the word patriarchy. And so
Mhm.
I want to ask you, what are the roots of sexual shame, where is it coming from, and how is patriarchy intertwined in all of this?
I want to just lay it down here before we start talking about anything. This is not about man bashing. I know that there's going to be some people who listen to this and go, oh, I'm so sick of that term, toxic masculinity and
Hmm.
patriarchy. Patriarchy can be divine. There is a divine masculine leadership that is really beautiful, that is honorable, that is protecting women, that is serving women. And we all know people, at least a handful of men like that in our lives. I'm speaking about toxic patriarchy,
Hmm.
right? And that is very much for a lot of us what we grew up in, and the systems that we live in is very systemic, right? They're based on a colonizer mindset, which is a type of um, touch or a type of look that is, I'm here to dominate you, not I'm here to understand you, but I'm here to dominate you. And so I've written down 4 roots of sexual shame. I'm just going to go to this one right now because I happen to just talk about it, is
Yeah.
the pornification of the globe. So I can, even if you yourself don't watch porn, if someone you know watches porn, they can touch you in that colonizer way. The touch of it can be a touch that is imbued with domination.
Hmm.
And that right there is my first cause, I'd like to say, is the roots of sexual shame, is the pornification of the globe, right? And the
Hmm.
way that we're taught through porn, again, even if you don't watch it, I don't watch it, it's like that invisible snake. It's weaving through people's consciousness.
Hmm.
And when I was really young, I thought that my vagina was ugly. And this week we've been working through uh, chakra number 2 in my 7 chakra course, and that's sacral chakra, that's svadhisthana, that's the womb chakra, sexual
Hmm.
expression. Almost every single woman in my 3 circles raised her hand when I asked, have you ever thought your vagina's ugly? Everyone
Right.
raised their hand, right? And so where does that come from, that we, as kids, we don't feel that way? So again, I believe it comes down to the pornification of the globe. It's like we see these images, we see um, people performing their pleasure, And immediately we're like, well, I don't look like that, right? We have
Mm.
women who are getting surgeries to get their pussies to look a certain way
Right.
because they don't think that their vulvas are beautiful, or because again, it's this mindset of, it's a pornified mind, you know?
Yeah.
That pornification of the globe is very deeply tied to media because it's all connected, right? It's like what we're watching on our screens. And,
Mhm.
and I know you feel me on this too. All the portrayals in the media of what it means to be a woman, what it means to um, be sexy, right? There's that end. And then there's also this whole um, Madonna whore split, right? That women have to face in this world. It's like you're either
Right.
pure, beautiful, virginal, right? Or you're a whore,
Mhm.
right? And to even enjoy your pleasure, to have pleasure for yourself, like your pleasure is supposed to be serving the man, right? And if it's not, and if you're having it for yourself, then you're a slut.
Mhm.
And so I think media plays a huge part in this because as we grow up, we get all these images in movies, magazines, like, the way a woman's supposed to be, all this pressure to, and I remember all those magazines growing up. It was like, 21 ways to turn your man on and all this stuff. And at
Yeah.
the same time feeling like, oh, but, be sexy, but don't be too sexy.
Because there's always so many multiple competing, ideologies and understanding. Like I was reading in a Cosmo magazine that Cosmo magazine, or even like the magazine 17, which is supposed to be catered to like younger women. All the women in those magazines were older, but it was catered to like 17, 18-year-olds. And, they're teaching you how to give they're giving you tips on how to give a blowjob. And then when you're watching movies on TV that are supposed to be teenagers in high school, all of those people are already in their 20s and close to their 30s. Like Rachel McAdams in Mean Girls was 26 at the time that she played like a 16, 17-year-old. And
Hmm.
so you're watching all these things and you're thinking, okay, this is how it is, and that's how it is. But then at home, I'm being told that you should never give away your virginity to a man. You should be pure and you should be a good girl, a good brown
Yeah.
girl. And so
Yeah.
there's multiple competing,
Yeah.
messaging going on all the time. And,
Yeah.
even when you're talking about, the pornification of the globe, I immediately I always think about how, when I was like in my late teens and early 20s, people around me were having a lot of sex and I
Mhm.
wasn't, because I was like, I don't understand it yet.
Yeah.
And, even though they were having a lot of it and they were watching a lot of porn, I was like, yeah, but you guys don't necessarily have an understanding of it. It feels like you're just doing it for the sake of doing it. And,
Mhm.
even when you're watching porn, you're using your mind. Like it's asking you to step away and out of your body. I
Mhm.
mean, it's an experience that you're experiencing in your body eventually at the end of it, but you're watching it with your eyes and it's not even like you're imagining your own body going through those emotions and sensations. You're
Mhm.
actually watching somebody else do it. And that always to me was always a little bit bizarre.
Yeah. Totally. Yeah. And I really think it comes down to an issue of because now we're just going layers as you and me are discussing the roots of sexual shame. We're just kind of going down through like the superficial layers to more
Mhm.
like the deeper and the deeper and the deeper layers. And I think at the deepest layer, it comes down to an issue of power, right?
Right.
We look back to some of our most ancient societies, like, women were there to propagate the species. You're the one who births humans. But in that, there's a huge creative life force. Like you are the Shakti. And
Mhm.
so for you to, I mean, that's why I think it was so important for the patriarchy here. I'm using quotations because it's using it in the toxic way. They had to control it. They had to control that that uncontrollable life force field in a woman's body, right? And so pitting women against each other, um, controlling women's sexuality by slut shaming, placing all the family's honor on her womb, which is literally insanity. But these are the types of insane ways that have kept pushing through the generations, and we still do stuff like that. There's still honor killings. And
Mhm.
I really think at the root of it is an issue of power, of how our ancient societies were um, built. And Unfortunately, it's still playing out, but it doesn't have a place anymore because as our consciousness is expanding and healing, we can see that, you know, what happens between two bodies, that sexual creative life force act is so feared, and yet that's all people want. It's such a fucking mind fuck. It's like
Mhm.
we're so scared of it. There's entire religions based on, telling you shouldn't do it, and yet at the deepest part of us, that's all we want is that union. We want,
Mhm.
and then you have priests in all religions raping children because you've submissed it. You've made it be so submissive in that religion, and that yet it still rears its head. So I
Mhm.
feel like we really need models and ways of teaching healthy sexuality to our children instead of getting it through all these fucked up ways, and that we wouldn't have any more things like rape. We wouldn't have sexual violence anymore if we would honor the sexual act as what it is, which is sacred,
Mhm.
right? And when we don't see it as sacred and we say, "Oh, it's bad." Dude, just look around. How many people have said in your life, in my life, women and men actually, that I was sexually abused. I was sexually abused. I was sexually abused.
Mhm.
It's fucked up. It's like every other person.
Yeah, and it's still something that like a lot of people don't openly talk about. Like yes, we're in this, we're in this era of, post Me Too movement and, we are talking about it more, but there's still so much shame attached to it. And, there's still so much stigma attached to it. And like to me it was just really interesting. Like I remember when I first told my dad about it, I mentioned that in the intro of this episode as well, that I talked to my dad about it and I said, 10 years after it had happened, I said, Dad, I experienced this when I was like younger. And it was like he was always waiting to find out. Like like I could just tell in his energy and demeanor that he was always waiting for his daughter to come to him and tell him that something had happened. It was like
Mm,
he was expecting it. And, he was like, I always thought that it might have happened, but I never really knew who it would be. And I said, "Why would you say that?" And he said, "Because like, in our culture, in our world, it happens often to people, and
right.
I would be very naive to think that it wouldn't happen to my own kid." And I was like,
Yeah.
"Wow." Like I never
Mm,
thought that. I just thought that my dad was walking around without that fear, but as a parent that he had that, fear in his body, in his mind. He always just expected it. But that expectation to me, I feel like it took me a really long time to like really get over and work through,
yeah, absolutely.
right?
It's like it's just not talked about. I really want to honor your dad for at least recognizing and understanding that, yeah, this shit
Mhm.
happens in our culture, not just in our culture, in all cultures, and incest and all kinds of things that nobody wants to talk about. And again, I keep coming back to this. If healthy models of sexual relating, like the actual roots of Tantra, right? And we're
Mhm.
taught to children and to see it as a sacred act, we wouldn't need to have people hoard their power over someone else with sexual violence,
Mhm.
right? It just wouldn't happen.
That exchange with my dad is a really interesting one, and I really wanted to talk to you about it because for me, I always felt like, so, I don't really have that many secrets between myself and my dad, and my relationship with my dad is a very special one. And so when I started to work through my own feelings of sexual shame and working with other spiritual healers, and going back to the roots of the sexual shame, my dad kept coming up a lot. And I felt like when I was younger, I was always told that like like I as the daughter am the honor of this family, and that
Yeah.
my dad doesn't wear a bug, but like that the daughters are like their dad's bugs, right? That's the same kind of honor. And so when I experienced sexual violence as a teenager, I feel like I sold my dad out. Like, I really feel like I was carrying this guilt because I was like, that is the one thing that this person has asked of me. And I couldn't even uphold that. And even though I know now in hindsight that it wasn't my fault, and,
Right.
like there was nothing that I did to do that, I still felt like I dishonored my dad somehow. And
Yeah.
so I feel like when I had to, like really releasing the shame and the guilt for me came from having a conversation with my dad. And you and I talked about this in our initial conversation too, that this idea of like the daughters of the patriarchy and in your
Mhm.
words, Sardara diyan Kuriyan,
Sardana de Gurdiya, yeah.
right? I would love to unpack maybe, why I had why I felt like I had to have that conversation with my dad for me to really move through it.
Yeah. I think the woman's body is a battlefield. I think um, we're again, it's so ancestral, right? We're taught from our parents and their parents and their parents that the it's like the honor of the family is in the woman's body,
Hmm.
and very much so that we're sardara the akuria. Even the way that's said, it's like I am the property of my dad,
Yeah.
right? It's like I am the property of the male, and that so needs to be dissected and just dismantled because it's toxic as fuck. It's so toxic. Until we claim our bodies as our own and really
Mhm.
understand that, I only belong to God and myself, and my body and what I choose to do with my body is not a reflection of my family, but it's mine. And
Mhm.
that vital reclamation process has to happen, right? And until then, like, these old programs are still running and we don't question them, and then we like you said, you felt shame and like you dishonored him, even though you weren't even the one at fault here. Like, it was done
Mhm.
to you.
Yeah.
And I have friends too, Indian women, who are like, I could never tell my dad that my brother actually had was trying to rape me for almost like my all my, like, from 8 to 16.
Wow.
These are the things that I listen to, and I'm like, are you
Mhm.
fucking kidding me? And she's like, well,
Mhm.
because, and I go, why? She goes, nobody would believe me.
Yeah.
They would tell me that I'm making it up, that I'm crazy, and that I'm bringing dishonor to the family. So instead of actually dealing with the perpetrator, right? And that's the divine masculine quality. That would have been dealing with the perpetrator and giving him a talking to, disciplining him, and helping him understand the healthy ways of relating to a woman. Instead of
Mhm.
that happening, no, let's not do that. Let's just victim shame,
Right.
right? And so it's just, I don't think we can change people at the end of the day. Honestly, Harpo, I think a lot of this is just about us dismantling this bullshit inside of ourselves about our power, about our sexual power, about who our bodies belong to, dismantling all that, and then carrying the healthy model over to our children.
Mhm. So let's talk about that. How do we start to do that inside of ourselves? And, how can we essentially undo the sexual shame or even begin to undo it so that we're not necessarily passing it on to our children?
Hmm. I think it's important to also understand that, you know, shaming is the feeling of shame is not something that babies are born with. Shaming is
Mhm.
done to us, right? The feeling of disgust of myself, that is taught. Just like racism is taught, right? Shame is taught. And if we can bring ourselves back to that joyous state of body pleasure that we were in when we were children, I think that's a beautiful place to start because that's innocent.
Mhm.
There's an innocence there that is so sacred, that all these parts of my body are God. All these parts of my body are a form of consciousness that is moving through space. And how magical is that? How delicious, how beautiful is that? How holy is that? That I have a physical body that can do all these incredible things and give me pleasure? Like, are you kidding me? Right? It's
Mhm.
kind of like getting that reframe of the mind, like of the way you see when you see a child playing, like they're just enjoying their bodies. Um, Teaching, it's kind of like we have to go through a process of inner reparenting, right? Just like you would teach a child, like, no, you can't just touch everyone's pee, right? Like,
Mhm.
like it's like
Yeah.
teaching those healthy boundaries to yourself. Like, I'm coaching somebody right now about that. It's like, how do I understand where I end and the other person begins? Like, because even if you don't, sexually abuse somebody else, like, you can have sexual energy that is inappropriate for certain situations where you're just like, there's a difference between being sexually liberated and using sexual energy in a way that's manipulative or like, yeah, there's a little bit of a shadow there that we have to learn how to work with. Like I said, we need we need a lot of schooling around this stuff. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah. So you work with primarily women. I know you've said you work with, anyone in the mass, collective. We didn't get to talk about this as much when you were talking about this like split between, this like pure virgin and this like Madonna whore. And you're working primarily with women. I want
Mhm.
to ask you, why do you think it is so important to you in the work that you're doing to do it in a collective sense, like to put a bunch of women in a room? Like
Yeah.
what's the value in putting a bunch of us together in a room and doing this work together as opposed to perhaps like doing it on your own in isolation?
I think both are important. You get the more deeper one-to-one, like shadow work and like awareness of one's own patterns in the one-to-one work. But in a group setting, I mean, we are a collective species, right? That symbol of the circle is so timeless. It's so ancient. It's how we heal. That feeling everyone gathering around the primordial fire, like we and then we also realize, "Oh, fuck, you have one too?" Like, "Oh, like, like, well, I'm not the only one who has this, weird way that my traumas, like, moved through my body and kinked my body. Like, oh, you have that too in a different way?" Like,
Mhm,
oh, it really does release that shame to see or to look around a room and see the mirror sisters. I sometimes use that term in circle. I'm like, "Look around at your mirror sisters," because
mhm.
we're all facets of the same diamond.
Right. Yeah, and I think it helps to challenge that like, this like weird pick me energy that we experience as women with one another where we think that,
Oh, right.
like that right there, like to split us between, women who are hypersexual and sexual, or like women who are not sexual, and like those, like that weird duality of like the good and the bad woman, all of
Mm.
that, I think like
Mhm.
doing that collectively helps challenge it, because not in a way where like the world is like, oh, like wow, like all these women are in a room together, but I know for me it's like I'm in a room full of women, and there are some in here that I've thought who are better than me, and there are some in here who I have thought I'm better than. And when we're in this room, we all start at the same baseline, because, like you said, we're all facets of the same diamond, and the patriarchy has affected all of us in a very
Mhm.
similar way.
And specifically, the patriarchy has done that by pitting us against one another. I mean, what
Hmm.
a way to control a population by having them be jealous and be in competition and all of this, you know, kind of dark energy with each other. And then when you put everyone in a room together and, you do some practices to help loosen up the ego a bit, you're like, holy fuck, like, I'm not here to be seen a certain way by anyone. Like, I'm here for
Hmm.
myself and I'm here for collective healing, but I can only do that if I am the realest I can be right now.
Right, right. Well, I think even, the act of the both of us having this conversation together and recording it in and of itself, I just know that for me, this is like the first time I've been able to openly say out loud anything that I said in this episode. And, I've been hearing from a lot of women in my life that they are finding value from these conversations, or like their daughters as young as 10 are listening to these conversations. And when I think about like how much I would have loved as a 10-year-old, as a 17-year-old, to like be able to know these things and to be able to like learn these things through people like Abneet and Harpo, I think to myself, like, wow, we're doing such an incredible job of just like
Yeah,
starting to talk about things that we've always been told not to talk about. And I have this friend in her 40s, and I remember she came to an event that I was hosting. And I think the reason we ended up becoming friends after that event was because she was like, your generation is asking questions that my generation wasn't even allowed to ask. Like
that's right.
asking the question of, whose body is mine? Is it mine or is it somebody else's? Like she's like, when I was
Mhm.
growing up, I wasn't even allowed to question whether my body was my own or not. And you're openly saying it out
Mhm.
loud. So, I'm just
Absolutely.
so happy that, we were able
Yeah.
to have this conversation together. And now it'll be out in the world for other women and other people to really listen to.
It's such a special healing moment, and I wanna thank you as well for your brave vulnerability and authenticity. These are the conversations that need to be had, and it's a beautiful thing.
Hmm. So I said in the intro that, I never got to work with someone like you, and I was working through those deeper, darker emotions where I felt really isolated and alone. But how beautiful it would be for someone who is wanting to kind of tap into this inner work to be able to work with you. So if someone is looking
Yes.
for that, or if you're listening to this and you're like, I know someone who would really benefit from having Abneet in their life, Abneet, how can these people reach you and how can they connect with you?
I would invite everyone to go to abneetsandhar.com. I know you'll provide that information after, but yeah, really the most in-depth way would be this beautiful container I've created. It's called the Embodied Woman Sacred Reclamation Accelerator. And it's a 12-week journey where we actually use the Indian chakra system, primarily the bottom three chakras, because that's where most of the society we've lost our power. Um, we work with the root chakra, the sacral chakra, and the solar plexus, really unpacking and dealing with issues of sexual shame, of dealing with roots and where are my roots, who do I belong to, and then we deal with power as well. Like, how do I take up space as a woman in this world today? You know,
Mhm.
um, do I let myself be seen? Can I use my voice, and how do I use my voice in a deeply empowered way? So it's really multifaceted, beautiful journey. And that's the most in-depth way with the 12-week reclamation container. And the other way is that I offer 7-week uh, the circle journeys called Awakening Shakti. And again, because I am a trained um, classical Indian yoga instructor as well, we work again in that 7-week program as a group up the chakra system. So we look at all the issues of how energy runs through the body, going up the chakras, and then we also work with tantric goddess archetypes from the Hindu mythology.
And you can follow Abneet on Instagram as well, where, that's where we connected. It's Abneet
Yes.
Sandhar Wellness on Instagram as well. And you can, I guess, like get to know who Abneet actually is and not just this beautiful, sexy voice that you
Oh.
have. I've just been so enamored by your voice this entire episode.
It does come in handy when your guiding meditations gets people to slow down.
Yeah, I could like listen to you all day telling me I'm a bad
Oh.
bitch. Like,
I love it.
I love
Oh,
it.
thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being on this episode. And thank you just so much for all the work that you're doing. Of course, like, I think that, there's people like you that are carrying a lot and you're doing so much for the collective. And so, from me to you, I just want to say thank you so much for, all the work that you're doing and just for being who you are. I think that you being so authentically yourself and just shining your light so bright has given someone like me the indication that I can be whoever the fuck I want to be because there's someone
Yes.
else out there doing it and they're so good at it. They're so happy with it. And so it's definitely a possibility. So thank you so much for that.
And this is going to sound cliche, but the light in me bows to the light in you, which is the meaning of namaste. So I'm feeling that right now. My hand is on my heart right now. I'm like, yes, shine, light shines with light. So right back at you, sister. Thank you.